Hello, I'm standing outside the Museum of German Early Romanticism in Jena, about 20 kilometers from Weimar. This building was once the residence of Johann Gottlieb Fichte. The museum celebrates the scientific and philosophical and linguistic movement here in Jena that was very much a part of Saxe-Weimar culture. When Duke Karl August came of age in 1775, Jena was a town of less than 5,000 inhabitants, but it drew many fervent young people to its university with the promise of an open-minded culture that privileged progressive discourse and the valuing of both natural science and speculative metaphysics. During the years of the late 18th century, and up until the time Napoleon entered the city in 1806, it was a community that embraced freedom from convention by way of many academic disciplines, including natural scientists such as Schelling, Loder and Ritter, theologians such as Griesbach and Paulus, philosophers such as Fichte, Schlegel and Hegel, and poets such as Novalis and Schiller. Together they achieved a high point for idealism, the privileging of mind as equal to or greater than nature, and formed the earliest stage of what became the Romantic movement. I've just been looking at a copy of the Athenian literary magazine published by the Schlegel brothers. I'm on the second floor of the museum, which celebrates the literature and poetry of early Romanticism and the quest for a new lifestyle guided by the Idealist Principles. It's as good a place as any to consider the core principles of idealism. Do matters of human subjectivity define the world we see around us, or is it the world around us that defines us? Essentially, this is a debate about the hierarchy of knowledge. Do aesthetics and ethics govern metaphysics and ontology, or is it the other way around? Idealism and the quest for freedom from convention, now influenced heavily by Kant's epistemology, whereby it's impossible to know anything of the world in itself, look to the former. Human subjectivity was privileged above scientific objectivity. The properties of the world and its phenomena are subject to the way that those objects appear to the observer, and do not possess these properties outside of the observer's experience of them. The very notion of mind-independent reality is a mind-dependent one. It was not an easy position to hold after the barbarities of the French Revolution and the murder of so many innocents in the name of freedom, coupled with ongoing political censorship in Prussia. It seemed untenable to bury the head in subjectivity and deny the importance of an objective morality. But Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach was an island of progressive attitudes in a world of struggle and intolerance, and sought the fundamental principles that lay behind appearances. The prevalence of random acts of violence and other tragedies that defined a contingent world would not deflect intellectuals from the truth that mind governs matter, and none since Bishop Berkeley have been as uncompromising about this position as Fichte. I'm on the top floor of the museum, the Green Room, which presents a synthesis of the philosophical ideas identified by idealism and the cultural conditions in the city that inspired such a wide range of intellectual discourse. This is an experiment exhibit from the laboratory of physicist Johann Ritter, who was drawn here to continue his work by Goethe, and who became involved during his time in Jena with research into electrolysis and electrochemical cells and magnetic polarities. Around the corner here is a modelled mind gallery pertaining to the work of the poet Novalis, whose work I'll look at in the next episode.
Goethe was responsible for many appointments at the university and was aware of the prevailing influence of Kantian thought. With the support of his benefactors, he'd already appointed the Kant scholar Reinhold to lecture on the transcendental method, and, since receiving the respected man's resignation, was looking for a suitable replacement. Fichte was familiar with Jena already, having studied at the theological seminary here in his early years, but his developing interest in Kant had persuaded him to travel to Königsberg in eastern Prussia to study with the esteemed fellow. Right after their first meeting, Fichte published an article on the transcendental method anonymously, which was at first attributed to Kant. When it became known that Fichte was the actual author, his reputation grew quickly and reached the attention of Goethe and others in Weimar.
So, Fichte was appointed to Jena as a disciple of Kant. However, by the time of his arrival, already he was fostering doubts about the transcendental method. He was concerned that the old man had failed to establish a fundamental principle able to justify his case. The reliance upon epistemic constraints was a powerful insight, but inadequate as a sole principle defining subjectivity. Furthermore, Fichte abhorred talk of the division between the noumenal world, the real world of a thing in itself, and the separate phenomenal world. He felt Kant had not fully addressed the metaphysical implications of idealism.
Robert Richards wrote, "During his 5 years at Jena, Fichte raised the philosophical stakes of discussion, and he made Goethe aware, as much through force of powerful personality as through his difficult ideas, of the liabilities of crucial aspects of the Kantian philosophy, especially the Ding an sich." In particular, Fichte was unhappy with Kant's explanations concerning the connection between cognitive and judgmental faculties of mind. He was convinced there was something else underpinning the problems of this connection, and it was the same problem that Descartes had faced in his definition of dualism pertaining to interactions between the mind-dependent world and the mind-independent world. Fichte could not accept the fact that Kant's free play between mental structures and free judgments lacked an explanatory principle.
Fichte said there can be no noumenal world. There is no mind-independent world. Existence comprises only of mind. The impressions of reality people see around them are merely illusion, the constructions of their own consciousness. The ego composes the world as an absolute ego. It is the composer of its own existence. There is no hidden thing in itself, lurking beyond some metaphysical veil, making the phenomenal world a shadow of some supposed noumenal domain.
Fichte argued that the mind possesses a sense of psychical intuition that is non-conceptual and therefore non-objectively determinable, yet still able to experience the ideal reality of existence. The subjective figure psychically intuits its subjective selfhood phenomenally, and therefore is able to identify that which is not the subjective selfhood, the otherness beyond the self. Furthermore, the subjective selfhood can then perceive introspectively, as a form of self-reflection, an aspect of the subjective selfhood perceiving itself perceive the otherness, and so forth as a limitless process. By way of this identification of selfhood and otherness, this psychical intuition enables the subjective selfhood to perceive the subject-object structure of empirical self-consciousness as an absolute subject, which encompasses all existence and ultimately explains away the objective otherness. Furthermore, empirical self-consciousness is revealed as the ultimate source of the primeval separation of the subjective selfhood from the essence of absolute being, and is consequently the explanation of sentiments of alienation. However, this doesn't imply that self-consciousness is exclusively self-limiting. In fact, it's this separation that enables the empirical self-consciousness to present the subjective selfhood as both autonomous and infinite on the one hand, and yet determined by the physical world and constrained by finitude on the other.
Fichte concluded that the epistemological and ethical domains of thought, represented by the faculty of psychical intuition and by knowledge of autonomous selfhood, are unified by this shared foundation. Consequently, the goal of a fully realized selfhood by way of employing the psychical intuition to penetrate the veil between the empirical and the subjective selfhood and realise absolute freedom is realisable.
In his work Foundations of Natural Right, published in 1796, Fichte argued that what is perceived of as a reality external to the mind is entirely a subjective construction of the mind. He said, "All being, that of the I as well as of the not I, is a determinate modification of consciousness, and without some consciousness there is no being." He said that self-consciousness is exclusively a social phenomena created by way of the development of an awareness of others as conscious beings.
Despite his revolutionary ideas, or perhaps because of them, things did not work out well for Fichte in Jena. He'd become embroiled in all kinds of scandal from the start. He was accused of republicanism and by implication contempt for the ducal court in Weimar for his support of the French Revolution, but he refused to retract his views. His anti-religious stance was no exception to prevailing norms, yet whereas the likes of Goethe and Karl August kept their thoughts to themselves, Fichte paraded his views openly and publicly. He was an antagonistic and quarrelsome man, and he caused a lot of people to become angry and annoyed with him. He developed a long list of enemies.
Furthermore, circumstances were difficult. In 1788, 6 years before he was appointed to the university, Duke Friedrich Wilhelm II of Prussia published an edict on religion, targeting the Enlightenment for scorning Christianity. Most likely it had been an effort to ward off political speculation by a new duke, driven to conservatism to protect his own situation. When the French Revolution followed only a year later, it was met by a subsequent edict in Prussia, enforcing censorship on anti-religious sentiment and requiring the destruction of offending publications and the incarceration of offending authors. It was made obligatory for the populace to attend church and communion. Kant received a warning about writing anything further that might be construed as undermining the absolutism of religious truth. Neighbouring Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, under the rule of Duke Karl August, took the opposite approach to that of Prussia. It was a liberal progressive dukedom with open doors to new ideas, and it should have been a safe haven for a man like Fichte, speculating on a new metaphysics that privileged the human ego and accordingly relegated God to the sidelines. There were still strong religious vested interests represented, and great sensitivity was required, but in general Weimar society and the Romantic community in Jena was relatively unaffected by political upheavals, not until the French and Prussian armies confronted one another in the fields between Weimar and Jena in 1806.
But as I've said, Fichte was not the sensitive type. Any kind of debate about his new idealism brought out the worst in him. He was ill-mannered, arrogant, and easily offended. Moreover, he was uncompromising about his status as an atheist. Finally, in 1799, incensed by the ongoing scandals, Duke Karl August sent him a letter of censure, inviting his resignation. Subjective idealism had fled to Berlin by the end of the summer.
Fichte was gone, but his ideas remain. In a previous chapter I discussed the transcendental method as it pertains to three aspects or levels of mind, but now I have a second model, that of Fichte's subjective idealism, which has a stronger sense of ontology as shown by the deep blue background. Rather than asserting mind cannot know reality, it posits that the empirical self-consciousness of subjective selfhood creates reality.
As I said before, my purpose in looking at Saxe-Weimar classical figures, such as Fichte, will be to consider the relevance of their ideas to current thinking on similar themes. Later, I'll look at the ethical work of Emmanuel Levinas and see how it pertains to Fichte's argument that the existence of other rational subjects is a necessary condition of every subject's self-awareness, and how the presence of others summons the selfhood from its unconscious starting point into awareness of itself as a free individual.
But for now, I want to pursue the epistemological aspects of Fichte's subjective idealism, and to consider how it might be possible today to justify that reality is created by the mind. Sir Michael Dermott was Professor of Logic at the University of Oxford until 1992, and in addition to his work in mathematics, language and metaphysics, he wrote extensively about the work of Frege, another Jena resident who we'll come to later, whose writings were a continuation of the tradition influenced by Fichte. In particular, Dermott looked at issues of truth and meaning, and the implications of these epistemological issues for matters pertaining to metaphysics, for realism and antirealism. He shared with Hilary Putnam the view that truth, denoting that which is to be considered the case, is dependent on the particular epistemic tools employed by the respective inquiry. It's a similar position to that of critical antirealism. Realism states that any particular propositional statement is justified by the truth of its correspondence with the world. To know that something is real is to know the circumstances that are necessary and sufficient for its truth. To know that a tree is comprised of cells is justified by the mind-independent fact that the tree is comprised of cells. Dermott applies this principle to mathematical concepts. Do numbers correspond to phenomena that can be identified objectively then? Do addition and subtraction actually exist? It's a debate I have with the mathematics teachers in my school all the time when they assert the existence of such entities by writing them up on the whiteboard.
Joking aside, Dermott would say that if realism is characterised as the application of truths to objects and events, whereby all existent phenomena is subservient to the notion of whether it's true or not, then antirealism privileges the plain assertion of truth. Applying the bivalence of realism to such empirical entities as thought, or the existence of other minds, or the existence of the past and the future, or to moral judgments and universals such as good and wonderful, or even to mathematical entities such as the number 1, or the number 2 for that matter, which were Dermott's favourites, is always going to be empty and essentially meaningless. However, antirealism does not fall into the same existential trap. Antirealism privileges an approach whereby meaning is understood by its epistemics alone, by the evidence and justification supporting it.
For instance, factual knowledge, such as I dreamt last night about the Fichte Museum, or the wall was green, or counterfactual knowledge pertaining to my belief that the video of me in the museum wouldn't exist if I hadn't actually visited the museum, cannot be verified as true or false by way of correspondence with the world. They can only be intuited subjectively by way of the epistemic conditions employed by the subject. As I've said, Dermott argued that all language and cognitive understanding is an applied faculty dependent not on correspondence with a mind-independent reality, but by the epistemic system used to justify it. Dermott asserts that there can be no knowledge outside of that epistemic and no mind-independent fact at all. The tones of Fichte's idealism are clearly apparent in this argument. However, antirealism does not need to countenance the solipsis aspect of subjective idealism, and in particular the argument that reality is created in an existential, metaphysical sense by the mind, the argument that sunk Fichte's ocean-traversing vessel before it was fully afloat. Instead of a mind-independent world acting as a foundation for justified true beliefs and statements, knowledge is dependent on the process of inquiry underpinning beliefs and statements. Given that Dermott was also an established scholar in the history and meaning of card games, I'll finish with another section from my piece of music that began this episode. It's my first symphony, the Glass Bead Game, based on the novel by Hermann Hesse. I'll play something from the fourth movement, the Fest- und Opfertanz, the festival and sacrificial dance. Thanks for listening.